Every single day, forces you've probably never even heard of are moving your money. The Fed, AI, geopolitics, currency wars. Most people, they only see the headlines, but they never really understand the signal beneath the noise. Well, that is exactly what MacroSignal is for. Yesterday, the US government released a number that affects literally every dollar in your wallet, every investment in your portfolio, and honestly, every financial decision you're going to make for the rest of your life. That number is 3.8%. That's the inflation rate for April 2026, and it's the highest it's been since May of 2023. Energy prices, they jumped 17.9% year on year. Gasoline is up an insane 28.4%. Shelter is up 3.3%. Now, most people heard that number on the news and just kind of moved on with their day. But if you don't understand what inflation actually is, like how it's created, how it's measured, what causes it, and most importantly, how to protect yourself from it, you are flying blind with your own money. Today, that changes. Make sure to save this explainer. Bookmark it right now. Think of this as your foundational Macro 101 reference guide. Come back to it every single time the headlines start to confuse you. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our mental roadmap for today. We'll start with the number in your wallet right now, then learn how to separate the signal from the noise by looking at headline versus core inflation. Next, we'll cover the global supply shock, domestic pressures, and the Federal Reserve's dilemma, before finally looking at the global economic outlook. Part 1. The number in your wallet. Let's talk about your personal finances. To truly understand global macroeconomics, we actually can't start in some fancy boardroom in Washington or Geneva. We have to start right at the micro level, your own personal finances, your grocery bills, your gas receipts. And that brings us straight to the recent data released from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. 3.8%. That is the official year-over-year inflation rate for April 2026. This isn't just some abstract statistic on a spreadsheet. It's a literal measurement of the purchasing power that is just melting away from your savings. At 3.8%, it's the absolute highest we've seen since May of 2023. But here's the thing, a single average number doesn't even come close to telling the whole story of what you actually feel when you swipe your credit card. We really need to look under the hood here. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the data breaks down those specific, everyday items that are driving the financial pain you're feeling. Just look at these April 2026 numbers. Energy prices as a whole jumped 17.9% year on year. Gasoline specifically, up a staggering 28.4%. And shelter, literally the cost of keeping a roof over your head, is up 3.3%. See, when the media talks about inflation, they're just blending all of these extreme spikes in with other goods that might not have moved much at all. But you don't buy an average economy, right? You buy gas, you pay rent, you heat your home. Part 2, headline versus core inflation, separating signal from noise. Because the prices of things like gas can swing so wildly from month to month, economists need a reliable way to separate the temporary noise from the actual underlying trend of the economy. This brings us to the absolute bedrock of macroeconomic measurement. You'll hear the acronym CPI thrown around a lot. That stands for the Consumer Price Index. Now I want you to imagine a giant imaginary shopping cart, a market basket. Every single month, government statisticians go out and they check the prices of thousands of items in this exact same basket. We're talking bread, haircuts, cars, rent, electricity, the whole shebang. The CPI is simply the measure of how the total receipt for that giant shopping cart changes over time. But here is exactly where we separate the amateurs from the pros. There are two main ways to read this receipt. The first is what we call headline CPI. This includes absolutely everything in the basket, and it's exactly what gave us that scary 3.8% number we just talked about. But economists, they actually prefer to look at something called core CPI. Core CPI takes that exact same basket but completely removes food and energy. Now, you might be wondering, why on earth would they ignore food and gas? Well, it's because food and energy prices fluctuate wildly due to crazy external events, like, say, a sudden freeze ruining an entire orange crop, or a geopolitical conflict disrupting oil shipments. By stripping those really volatile items out, core CPI reveals the true underlying economic engine. And for April 2026, that core CPI figure is sitting at 2.8%. So while the headline number is absolutely screaming at nearly 4% because of those massive gasoline spikes we looked at earlier, the core signal is actually lower. But make no mistake here, 2.8% is still stubbornly above the 2% target that central banks desperately want to see. The underlying engine of the economy is still running way too hot. And to understand why that is, we have to look outside our own borders. Part 3, the global supply shock. Let's look at external forces. we need to zoom out from our domestic shopping carts for a second and examine the massive global forces that are actively pushing those volatile energy prices upward. We live in a deeply interconnected world. A butterfly flapping its wings, or more accurately, a conflict erupting across the globe, shows up directly at your local gas pump. The data right now clearly points to some major macroeconomic drivers. As detailed by the Treasury Department and the International Monetary Fund, an ongoing conflict in the Middle East, specifically involving Iran, has severely disrupted global petroleum production and some absolutely critical transit routes. Ships are having to take much longer, way more expensive detours. And this doesn't just raise the price of oil. It creates massive ripple effects. It raises the cost of transport for literally everything. And because natural gas is used to make fertilizers, it eventually pushes up the cost of growing the food that ends up right back in your CPI basket. And this brilliantly illustrates the exact economic definition of what we're experiencing right now. The IMF's April 2026 World Economic Outlook calls this a textbook negative supply shock. So what is that? Well, a negative supply shock happens when the cost of producing and moving goods just suddenly spikes, severely disrupting supply chains. It reduces the overall supply of goods while simultaneously pushing their prices much higher. It's basically a double whammy. It feeds directly into headline inflation while completely eating away at your actual purchasing power. But the real danger here isn't just the initial shock, it's how the entire global economic network reacts to it. Think about it. When energy prices surge, your paycheck doesn't go nearly as far, right? Naturally, workers start demanding higher wages to recoup that lost income. Firms, who are already facing higher energy bills and now higher labor costs, well, they respond by raising the prices of their products even further to protect their margins. This risks triggering what economists absolutely fear most, a dangerous wage price spiral, where inflation becomes this self-fulfilling, continuous loop that is incredibly difficult to break once it gets going. Part 4, Tariffs and Domestic Pressures. Let's bring it back home. Okay, let's bring the focus back to domestic shores. Because while foreign energy shocks are capturing all the big headlines, they definitely aren't the only pressures keeping our inflation elevated. The calls are kind of coming from inside the house too. We have several very strong domestic pressures at play right now. First, recent shifts in U.S. trade policies have increased the effective statutory tariff rates on imported goods. Second, we're seeing elevated prices in core services, things like medical care and just surging airline fares. And third, despite all of these price hikes, the U.S. labor market remains remarkably resilient. Private payroll growth is surging and worker wages are actually continuing to outpace inflation. Now, a strong labor market is fantastic for workers, obviously, but it also means consumers still have money to spend. That keeps demand high and basically prevents prices from naturally falling. So the crucial point here is understanding who actually pays for these trade policies. As highlighted in this excerpt from the IMF's analysis, evidence indicates that the direct incidence of these increased tariffs has largely fallen squarely on U.S. importers and consumers. See, when a tariff is placed on a foreign good, that foreign country doesn't just write a check to the U.S. government. Nope. The U.S. company importing the good pays the tax at the border, and then they simply pass that extra cost directly onto you, the consumer, which just further fuels that core CPI goods inflation. Part 5, the Federal Reserve's Dilemma, Stepping into the Control Room. So let's recap. We have external supply shocks pushing up energy, plus internal pressures from tariffs and a hot labor market keeping core prices elevated. It is time to step into the control room of the economy and see exactly who is trying to manage this incredibly complex, highly volatile machine. What you're looking at is the seal of the Federal Reserve System, the central bank of the United States. Specifically, we're talking about the FOMC, the Federal Open Market Committee. They have what's called a dual mandate, which was given to them by Congress. Basically, they have two jobs. They must support maximum employment while simultaneously maintaining stable prices. And they define stable prices as returning inflation to a 2% objective. Right now, employment is super strong, but inflation is stuck well above 2%. They have to figure out a way to fix the inflation problem without accidentally destroying the entire job market in the process. Their primary tool to cool down the economy is adjusting interest rates. As of their March 2026 meeting, the FOMC voted to maintain the target range for the federal funds rate at 3.5 to 3.75%. By keeping borrowing costs elevated like this, they make it much more expensive for businesses to get loans to expand and for you and me to get mortgages or finance cars. This effectively slows down the economic engine with the ultimate goal of reducing demand just enough that prices finally stop rising. But the Fed faces the ultimate dilemma here. Read this quote from their March 2026 minutes carefully. It says the committee would be prepared to adjust the stance of monetary policy as appropriate if risks emerge. This means they are entirely data dependent. They are absolutely not on some preset course. If the Middle East conflict pushes oil up even further, inflation risks rise, and they might actually need to hike rates. But on the flip side, if those high rates suddenly cause companies to lay off thousands of workers, well, employment risks emerge, and they might need to aggressively cut rates. They must remain incredibly nimble, essentially balancing on a razor's edge. Part 6, the global economic outlook. What happens next? Let's move forward and see how this all builds into the broader future. What happens if the Fed guesses wrong, or if global events just spiral completely out of their control? To figure that out, we look to the International Monetary Fund's predictions for what happens next. The IMF ran a couple of different scenarios. In their baseline projection, they basically assume oil averages around $82 a barrel for 2026, which would allow inflation to slowly cool off. But they also modeled an adverse scenario. If the geopolitical conflict is prolonged and severe, pushing oil well over $100 a barrel and keeping it there, the consequences are pretty stark. This kind of shock would severely slash global economic growth down to just 2.5% for the year, all while keeping headline inflation punishingly high. And honestly, here is the truly sobering part. Right after the pandemic, we had incredibly high inflation, but central banks generally managed to bring it down without causing a massive global recession. Why? Because that inflation was largely driven by temporary supply chain bottlenecks that eventually cleared up. Economists call that a steep aggregate supply curve. But the IMF warns that today, the global supply curve is much flatter. That means if central banks are forced to hike interest rates even further to combat this new energy shock, forcing inflation down this time around will likely be much more economically painful. It would require a very real, significant slowdown in actual economic activity and job growth. Which leaves us with the trillion-dollar question that is going to define your financial reality over the next year. Will inflation expectations stay anchored, allowing this energy shock to pass without permanent damage? Or will this new surge in costs trigger that dreaded wage price spiral, forcing central banks into a corner where their only option is to induce a painful recession? Look, keep this explainer saved as your ultimate reference guide as these events unfold. When the media hits you with panicked headlines, come back here to find the signal in the noise. Stay focused, stay informed, and we will see you next time.